Hello, and welcome to the Vocal Revolution podcast, where we talk about the power of voice to change our worlds, personally and collectively. And my amazing guest today is Reverend Dr. June Boyce Tillman, MBE, who has had the most extraordinary, long, groundbreaking, and illustrious career. June is an innovative educator, and she read music at Oxford University and taught in primary and secondary schools in London. Her work and music introducing composition in the classroom has been used worldwide, and she is Professor Emerita of Applied Music at the University of Winchester and an extraordinary professor at Northwest University, Potchefstroom, South Africa. As a composer, June's large-scale works for cathedrals involve professional musicians, community choirs, people with disabilities, and school children. Her hymns and songs have been published in the collection A Rainbow to Heaven. A pioneering advocate for women's role in both spiritual and secular music, June has created one-woman shows based on the life and music of medieval abbess Hildegard of Bingen. As a writer, she is published widely on topics around spirituality and edits the Music and Spirituality series for Peter Lang, which includes her books Experiencing Music, Restoring the Spiritual, Music as Wellbeing, and her autobiography Freedom Song, Faith, Abuse, Music and Spirituality, A Lived Experience. She founded the International Music, Spirituality and Wellbeing Network to share expertise and experience in this area. An Anglican priest at All Saints Church, Tooting in South London, June has pioneered interfaith dialogue through projects such as her Space for Peace event at Winchester Cathedral, which I was very honoured to attend some years ago. And I remember being absolutely blown away by the sight of an imam and a rabbi singing a duet, one in the lectern and one in the pulpit. And it just said so much about how their musics interwove and had commonality as well as difference. And for me, that was a very special moment to witness that alongside all the other things that were happening in the cathedral, beautiful sound healing and choral works. But that moment particularly, I found it unforgettable because it was such a message of peace and how we can all sing together across and through difference. So I'm really grateful June is here. And June has two sons and a granddaughter, and now speeds around on a red mobility scooter, often too fast, she tells me. So, June, welcome and thank you so much. And I understand you have even a poem about the red mobility scooter.
Oh, yes. Like it's got a title like When I'm Old, I Will Wear Purple, but it's not about purple, but a red mobility scooter. When I am an old woman, I shall ride my red scooter too fast on the common until it tips me into the bed of bluebell flowers. And I shall not panic. I shall laugh until a song comes and commune with the bluebells until I can hear them sing their blue song. I shall get drunk on the singing and lie in the middle of them in the sunshine and feel the warmth on my face and in my heart. And I shall not worry about how I shall get up, because I shall enjoy the time in the bluebell wood and not want it to end. And I shall tell passers-by that I do not need help. And would they like to join me on the bluebell mattress and join in the bluebell song and get them to know the bluebell and hear their bells a ring, 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 ring in the Cathedral of the Wood, which is a better cathedral than Southwark. And now we can hear the music of the wood in all its fullness. Who needs an orchestra when there is one ready-made orchestra to accompany our songs right around us?
Wow. 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 What a wonderful way to start. The orchestra of songs all around us. And it feels to me like you have lived your life within that orchestra of songs, June.
Yes, I think it's interesting because so much of singing has been about human beings. But as I've got older, I've learned to appreciate, well, the music of the birds, which people have often talked about, but, the music of the trees and the music of even the earth itself and the bugs and the things living inside the earth. And I've been interested, I haven't really achieved it a great deal, of how we can include the earth in our song, which I suppose is what that funny poem is about. Why have we invented soundproof studios? And why have we not let the birds and the sound of the wind in the trees and so on into it? And would that not be a way of including the earth in our thinking of interrelationship? And so I've got a machine called the Music of the Plants, which um, turns we're not quite sure what it is, either the movement of the water or the energy in the plants or both, into musical sounds. And then I and my friends Mita and Alistair, about once a month, we improvise with the plants. Um, and I think that's where I want to go now, which is what can we do? I suppose I was quite heavily influenced when I was a child by Beatrice, I've forgotten her surname, who played her cello with the Nightingales. It was one of the early BBC broadcasts, and so on. Now, some people say it was a fake, but the notion that we could sing with the birds and that the birds are not just singing, which is what our patriarchal society has said, to attract partners, but they're singing just like we sing, just for the joy of doing it and for expressing what they feel, um, and rethinking, well, the nature of nature. We've regarded it as the biggest mistake, I think, that we've made in our culture is the word inanimate,
Mm,
because nature is all animate. They're animate creatures like we are. So why can't we build pieces with them, with our song and their song and so on? I mean, in a sense, the indigenous people of many of the continents have always thought that. But our so-called enlightenment, which I prefer to call the endarkenment, um, actually has turned them into other than us. But like all of creation, they're all made like we are, of earth, air, fire, and water. There's nothing else that you can make any creatures from. And so why have we diminished them so much and said that we're great human aesthetic creatures and the birds are just singing because they want a partner? I mean,
I know it's crazy.
it doesn't work for me.
No,
And so I built a house at the bottom of my garden which has doors which can open so that, you hear the sound and so on. And I suppose that's what that poem is about. Why do we have soundproof? Why do we not let the world in? And I still am sort of horrified at people running on the common with headphones on. I mean, if you're going to run on the common, why not understand who's already singing on the common? You know?
absolutely. It's a good question. It's a really good question. And I feel like, yes, so much. Well, it's very obvious that there was a very obvious agenda for the I was going to say dehumanizing, but obviously it isn't, it's desentientizing of nature. You know, when we pretend that nature is not sentient, then we can justify doing all these horrific things like factory farming and exploiting the earth because it's just a thing, it's just matter. Whereas if we have to actually acknowledge that we are nature, we're not actually separate from nature in any shape or form because every breath we take involves taking in air. That's just to start with, you know. So every part of us on every level is part of nature. And yet we have created this false illusion of being the top dog species that can do what they want to nature. And I
And look
think
what
that,
we've done,
yeah,
wrecked it. I think it's one of you talked about Space for Peace, and one of the lovely stories that I love about Space for Peace. I started it with writing a piece for the Church Colleges and Universities Festival. And if you remember, one of the pieces of Space for Peace, in the middle, everybody does what they want to do all around the cathedral. And then everybody gets a single note. and then they sing a word for peace on that single note. And that was in this piece, which was a sort of precursor to it. And one of the women who was, and she said to me, she said, I've been singing for 40 years, and singing for me was always is the next note a crotchet or a quaver, or is it B flat or B natural? She said, and I thought, how stupid being asked to sing a single note. I mean, what's this woman, the composer, thinks she's doing, just writing a single note?
Mm.
And she said, but when I did it in the cathedral, I realized that I'd got singing all wrong. Singing is about breath coming in and out of the body. As I walked along singing my one note, I realized that I'd got singing all wrong and that it was about the breath coming in and going out of my body. And thank you for reminding me of what singing really is about.
Yeah, it's this incredibly innate, natural expression within us, and yet so many other things get put on top of it, particularly around performance, entertaining, showing or demonstrating musical skill, which all of which are valid in their, right circumstances, but that can sometimes take us away from just the innate natural experience that singing is something that is like our birthright, something inside of us, like the birds. It's as natural as that. Yeah.
Well, one of the songs that I recommended, and very interestingly, I've written quite a lot of pieces over the years and got very little money for it. But when I was teaching um, small children from 4 till 7, one of the sort of songs I recommended um, was a one-note song. So, and in one of my very early books, I think it was Mrs. Macaroni, um, there was a small song which was a snail crawls along on a long silver trail. I wonder where he's coming from. I wonder where he's going. And that was used all over the world and brought me in more money than a 2 hour opera with oceans of people. Um, because I thought that with little children, it was important to have one note songs that you pitched on different notes. So whichever note was the child's note, that it was validated. So sometimes I'd pitch it quite low and sometimes quite high, and people could find their voice. And one of the troubles with singing in schools was that most of the songs, and remember, I was teaching initially in the 60s, sort of lay between the F above middle C and well, probably from about D above middle C up to the top D, because everybody said that little children sang high. In my experience, little children, not all little children, did sing high. Some
Mm.
children had really quite low notes below middle C, and so on. And in general, those people never learnt to sing because they couldn't sing at the pitch that they were required to sing at,
Mm.
and so on. And then I thought about why we'd got this notion of where young people sing. And of course, it was from the cathedral choir. And of course, the cathedral choir had already been selected to sort out those people who could sing, between in a certain compass. And
Yeah.
so and to encourage every child in the class to acknowledge their voice. And I think the one note song, which enables you to fall in love with your note, is important. And if you swing it around in a classroom, then everybody gets validated. But what happened in singing in school was that some people's note wasn't even on the map
Mm.
of singing. And it was a
Yeah.
bit like the lovely Irish joke of the person lost in the Irish countryside asking the way to Dublin. And
Yeah.
somebody says, if I were going to there, I wouldn't start from here. So they
Mm.
never ever got under starters' orders because their note, and I've spent a lot of time in individual workshops with people, getting them to find their note, particularly the people who've lost it or from whom it's been taken away,
Yeah.
because it's important that we learn to love our note again. I often say it's best done in the shower
Yeah.
because the tiles and the water make it sound beautiful. And just sing wherever it feels right for you to sing and fall in love with your, in a funny way, it's like an anorexia but it's a vocal anorexia. You've fallen out, just like the anorexic has fallen out of love with the body. So they've fallen out of love with the sound that they can make. And they need to re-establish that relationship because there's nobody without a sound, but we've validated only a small range of sounds, which
Yeah,
means that we've been very exclusive. That's
absolutely.
been true of the church. The church has had quite an influence on that. And
Yeah,
certainly, even the training of clergy, Bertram Sher writing about this, that some people gave up being clerics because they couldn't sing in the right style for
yes,
it.
yeah,
Um, so the validation of different notes but different styles of singing and so on has been has been one of my real missions in life. That everybody has a note, they just need to find it and validate it.
absolutely. No, that's absolutely so powerful. And it reminds me, I've just recently come back to doing, as part of my choir warm-ups, a beautiful exercise by John Stevens, who did Search and Reflect. He was a jazz musician. And basically, that's all you do. On each breath, you sing any note, any sound on a vowel sound that you want, and everyone is singing at the same time. And of course, at the beginning, everyone's going, well, this sounds just bonkers. But actually, then everyone harmonizes and comes in. But the idea is not to harmonize. You don't have to. You just sing whatever comes to you spontaneously. And it creates this incredible, amazing sound, which has got so many things within it. And yeah, I find those exercises that just allow us to be with our voice rather than constraining it or feeling it has to go into a certain shape. And as you say, that's had so much impact in education and in both, yeah, music education and in church education, all the places where we get conditioned, basically. Where is our voice? And who gets to
Yes,
say
I mean,
how
one
it's
of the
done?
loveliest things on those workshops that I do initially is what I call a humming bath. So
Mm,
you put two people in the middle of the circle and everybody else around the outside, and the intention is to love the person in the middle, the people in the middle.
mm,
Um,
mm.
and you must hum the note that's easy for you because you're going to hum it for about 5 or 10 minutes. So there's nobody gives you a note. You must hum the one that's easy for you, and you hum, and then you walk to the middle, closer to the people, but you don't touch them, and you move back, and that's beautiful, absolutely lovely. I mean, there are all sorts of contrasts and things in that. And then I say to people, well, I hope none of you were going to tell me you couldn't sing because you've just made, 30 people feel wonderful by your singing.
Yeah,
So how is it you've fallen out of love with the voice? And in the middle, what the people feel, and it's a very useful therapy, particularly for people who've been abused sexually, and when touch has been abused, because people do feel touched. They're not actually touched with a finger, but the sound of the communal humming gives them a sense of being touched without having actual finger touches on
yeah,
them. And so it's a very beautiful way. And my students at university used to say, "Can we do a humming bath to start with?" Um, and that notion that we've always said in classical music, well, somebody must give you a note and then you must find all the other notes in the chord. But actually, you can hear people adjusting without any instruction. To a sense, that was what was Space for Peace was about. Let everybody
mm,
do their own thing, and then they work out how what they can do can fit with others. They don't get told by a conductor or by a composer. They work out for themselves. It's peace from the bottom up rather than from the top down.
yeah,
And I suppose in peace, everybody quotes to me the Divan Orchestra with Barenboim, and
yeah,
that's lovely, and they're playing together. But in a sense, they're all playing the same sort of music. The real challenge for for peacemaking is how do you bring together these the differences that have
yeah,
been created all over the world, and not ask everybody to conform, well, to the literate music of the Western canon. And
yeah,
that's the real challenge. And I was
yeah,
asked once to there's a group of international students who were trying to make a piece for an international conference. And I got there a bit late to help them. By the time I got there, all the American students had told the students from the Middle East that they sang out of tune. And the steel pan player from the Caribbean had told all the others that they didn't play in time. And it was, these all these traditions had developed different ways, and everybody thought their way was right. But the real answer is how do we give respect for this difference? And
Yes.
I'm very coloured by the book by Jonathan Sacks, the ex chief rabbi, called The Dignity of Difference, in
Right.
which he said that unless we give difference dignity, we shall blow the world up.
Yeah.
Um, if ever there was a contemporary statement, it's that.
Yeah.
But how do we do that in music, particularly when Western classical music has held a very sort of high esteem and we've marketed it? I mean, I was brought up in a school where I was told, wasn't it wonderful that we took Bach to and we called them the natives of Africa, assuming it was much better than the drumming and the singing traditions
Yeah.
there. And how do we acknowledge this variety and how do we bring it together? I mean, that's real peacemaking, not
Yeah.
making us all the same and subscribe to the same. But and it's hard. It's
Really
as
hard.
hard as any as building a peace plan, between the Middle East and America at the moment. But it's. I mean, I don't know whether I've done anything towards it, but I've done my best.
You've made a great, huge contribution, and I feel, well, yeah, just from myself, just I know that I've been touched by it, and it's inspired me to think, okay, this is possible, because I think we're full of narratives, we're bombarded with narratives that it's not possible, that it's not possible, that we have to be divided from people that are different from us, that we should somehow not like each other, that we should be suspicious of each other or fearful of each other, because we look different or we do different things or we cook differently, and all this kind of fear and that we're wound up into kind of by various sources of conditioning and media and stuff. And I feel that anything that shows in whatever small way that it's actually possible, and actually that it's as natural as, sitting in the park listening to the birds. A bird is a different species to me, but I'm not going to, well, some people might, but I'm not, personally, I'm not going to get a gun and shoot it just for being different. So, that's what we're doing with other human beings so often is, this person is different from me, so I need to either exclude them from my environment or, yeah, behave differently towards them. And actually, we're all as variegated as the leaves on the trees, and
Absolutely.
how we live
Well, that's
together.
the interesting thing because on the one hand, we're all made from the same stuff. On the other hand, it's appeared in a million trillion forms that this stuff can be put together and so on. And I think probably uh, in my older age now, I've come back to where I was as a child because I was an only child of with very few friends and a mother, I think, who was quite ill and did break down when I was quite small and went away. And the garden was my place. So my initial singing was to the plants and so
Mm,
on because I didn't have anything else or anyone else really, and I didn't have any friends. And I suppose that's where the spirituality came in as well. The spirituality was a natural spirituality. So it was quite natural to sing to the cat or sing to the tree and so on because they were my friends, and to
yeah,
sing to God because
yeah,
God was my friend
yes,
and so on. And only when I got to school did we start being in a situation. Well, of course, it was singing at church, but in general, I couldn't do it. And also, of course, you had the gender, because the story that fired my work on feminism in the church was that we had to sing, Oh Jesus, I Have Promised. And we had a sort of selection procedure. And I won to sing it in the church hall when I was relatively little. And but I couldn't sing it in church because only boys sang in church.
wow.
Um, and I nobody made any sense of that for me. But going back to real gender stuff and spirituality, I assumed that because God was male, he preferred boys' voices. Um, and of course, then I started to work, for getting girls in the cathedral traditions and so on. And that was a struggle. We had to work hard because that tradition, and there's still some people who will defend the boys' only choir and so on. So it was a struggle, and we were shouted down and ridiculed and told, of course, boys sang better than girls. But
Wow.
in fact, when you put a girl and a boy behind a screen and people listen to them, even church organists couldn't reliably tell you which was a girl and which was a boy. And so that was a really long struggle. And one of the one of the colleges, which shall be nameless, we had a woman there who described how she was singing in the choir, and there were men in the choir, of course, as well. But the men were paid, and the women weren't. And when I got in touch with the director of music here, I was told that the men wouldn't do it unless they were paid, but the women would do it anyway. Um, so
Wow.
I mean, the struggle for getting women's voices heard. And of course, the sound that we've still not got in our cathedrals. We've got the all men and boys choir. We've got the male voice choir. We've now got choirs with girls and choirs with women on the top. We've not got the women's voice choir in the cathedral tradition.
Yeah.
When are we going to have if we can have an all men's voice choir, why can't we have all women's voice choir? I mean, women of my age can sing down into the bass compass. Da 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 da. I call them the wisdom notes. You only get them when you've been around for a bit, really.
Yes, yes. You earn them. Yeah. Yeah, I get it. Yeah, no, it's a big question, isn't it? Why isn't that? And why is that in well, we know why. It's all been about power and control, really. But it's really time that we have more women's voices. And also there are so many um traditions, even in this country, if we go back, the women's circle, the singing circle, even if you look at
Absolutely.
the keening of, let's say, Irish women at funerals, which was generally phased out, but there would have been many circles of women singing for very varied different purposes, whether it was women coming together to sing as part of helping a woman give birth, or it would have just been woven into our everyday lives, as was so much singing actually, and as we've industrialized, we've lost a lot of that connection, haven't we?
Well,
Um,
I think it's important to remember that because when I was in Lithuania, I found a midwife who was going out into the forests, and she was singing in particular for women who were now pregnant, who'd had a miscarriage. And so a
Mm.
circle of women, and they sang, they had revived the women's tradition of suartines, which was a women's tradition in Lithuania, and so on. So, people are beginning to try and revive it. And what was interesting was that people hadn't even thought it through. I mean, one of the leaders of the church music, sort of boys sing better than girls. And I wrote him a letter. He was also one of the inspectors for music in schools. And I said, well, you may be right, but until we've given girls the opportunities that the boys choristers have had, and until we've allowed them to sing in the wonderful acoustics of a cathedral, actually, you haven't tried it out yet. You know?
Yeah.
And interestingly, for a man in that position, who was actually very wise in many ways, he said, well, Juna, yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Because, he was just conditioned into what was obvious, appeared to be obvious to him and to his contemporaries and to everyone that had come before him. So he was just enrolled into that. But then it's all of these kind of traditions and prejudices. As soon as we start taking them apart and actually applying logic to them, you go, well, actually, nobody's ever tried it.
Absolutely.
So how do you know?
That's right.
It's
That's right.
ridiculous. And to tell me about Hildegard of Bingen while we're talking about women's voices, because I know she's been so important to you, and some of our listeners may not be aware of her amazing story, and also its relationship to you. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I I started life as a dancer at 3, as most little girls were, and I was quite a good dancer, particularly in tap. Although ballet, I always prayed it. My first prayer was that there wouldn't be a tutu in the next show because I was always a rather podgy girl, and a tutu was not the best garment. And my best song was in Top Hat and Tails. Um, and it was a song called Confidentially that I could tap my way through and sing. Then I had piano lessons. Um, and I initially there were some pieces by women, teaching pieces, Jessie Furs and people like that. But the further I went up classical music, the more women disappeared.
Mm,
My piano teacher was a woman, but once I got to Oxford, there was not a single woman um, teaching on the staff, and there were 36 men and 3 women
mm,
in the as students. So finding Hildegard, who's a medieval nun, 1098 to 1175, that's right. She's in the 12th century, who sang 77 songs in a morality play with music. I mean, 3 theological texts, many medical texts, and so on, and challenging the church of her day, saying it was not right that clerics had a tunic and a cloak. But why didn't they give their tunic to the poor who didn't have either a tunic or a cloak? To find a woman, and she is actually not the first woman composer in Europe, but the first named composer in Europe at all.
wow.
Um, so she transformed my life really,
Yeah.
because I realised that women could do it because the hidden curriculum of the classical world was that women couldn't. And even when I was in Slovenia, um, and I was at one of the conservatoires there. Um, I sang some of my music and sang some Hildegard and so on. And the women all surrounded me. And some of a lecturer or some people had told them that women make babies and not and they don't compose. And that was at the beginning of this century.
Mm,
So that myth of women making babies and not composing was well established. And I look at my lovely piano teacher, who's a lovely woman, Miss Rowe in Southampton. I mean, there was Bach and Beethoven. There were the statues on the piano, but there was no statue of Hildegard. So from Hildegard, I first started transcribing her songs and singing them and using some of her music in my music. Um, and then eventually my own composer arose, but she was the great role model, really. The first, now, of course, I've worked hard, and many other women have worked hard to get people like Fanny Mendelssohn and Clara Schumann and sort of established in there,
mm,
and Ethel Smythe. But, in those days, there wasn't anybody. There were
mm,
no role models. So the hidden curriculum was that you couldn't do it. And I mean, even at Oxford, really, I was surrounded by the men who became conductors and composers. But the assumption was that we women would become teachers. And that
mm.
was all that was open to women, really.
Yeah.
Um, so I think Hildegard, I owe her an immense debt. And in the end, I used to go to the Abbey, the Abtei St. Hildegard, quite a bit. And I wanted to say more about her because in the 1980s she wasn't very well known. And she stood at my shoulder and she said, "Don't talk about me, be me." And so I invented the one woman show. And I told her story as if, I am Hildegard. I know the cost of keeping silence and I know the cost of speaking out. Hear my story. Perhaps
Mm.
you know me as Hildegard of Bingen. And so the story goes on. And I wrote a series of meditations with her music, my music. And that was the first one woman show I did. And then I went on to do another 21 woman shows. Um, and that too was a feminist, because although I learned at Oxford to write a symphony and a fugue, and choral pieces, um, that, it's the pieces themselves were created by men. So
Mm.
what would women have done if they'd created things? Well, we're storytellers. I mean, what are we doing here now but telling our stories one to the other? So I
Yeah.
thought what women would have done was these one woman shows which use music, movement, song, poetry to um, uh, just as a unit. And
Yeah.
that was similarly the pieces that I wrote for Winchester Cathedral, um, where you had a professional orchestra, but you also had children with profound learning difficulties, and
Yeah.
ordinary schools, and the choir for people with dementia and so on, all together. And in those cases, what I did was I did write some of it, or I suggested things. And if people said, I can't do that, I'd say, well, what can you do? So they'd bring their own stuff. So the piece was collaborative. And also the director of the community choir would conduct her bit, or the school teacher would, and then it would come back to me for the big thing. So there was shared authority.
Mm.
The students said, well, you threw your authority over to the community choir, and then she threw the ball back to you, and so on. So I started and then people would say afterwards, well, I don't know what I've just seen or heard. I say, good,
Mhm.
um, because I wanted to create new ways of being. So not being a composer who controlled the whole thing,
Yeah.
but co-working with everybody. And so I saw music as what the church should have been, but has failed at usually, to be able to bring everybody of whatever skill together,
Yeah.
from people who would never stand, never talk, to a solo violinist who could play extremely complex things, and soloists from the university who were beautiful singers. So I Hildegard made me aware that we could do it.
Yeah.
Um, and so she was very important, and I think is important in the discovery. And so many people said she was the first woman composer in Europe. And it took me a while to realize she wasn't the first woman composer. She's the first named composer in
Yeah.
Europe. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and I think the dilemma of how to be a woman, I think that's what's plagued my life, how to be a woman with a profession and so on, and also a mother, and how all of that lot's played out, I think, is what Joanna Trollope, who was a contemporary of mine at university, said. We were at university studying the same things as the men, but we were also expected to find a partner and bear children, and
Yeah.
nobody told us how that lot was supposed to fit together, and it
Mm.
didn't.
Yeah.
And Clara Schumann, I love Clara Schumann. She writes in her diary, having written a piano concerto at 14, she writes in her diary, before I met Robert, I thought women had some creativity in them, but now I realize that women should not compose
Wow.
because of the demands, you see, of
Yeah.
these things. But what having children did was to change from singing a song rightly and making sure that I'd sung an F natural when it was an F natural and I hadn't sung an F sharp. As soon as I had to sing my children to sleep, then it didn't matter anymore.
Yeah.
You could start singing something you knew, but you could veer off to whatever because you were just singing in order to get the child to sleep. So
Yeah.
there was none of this authenticity about it. The authentic thing was just to keep singing until you'd achieve what you wanted to achieve. Yeah. And so
Yeah.
improvisation, and it's not, well, is it singing? This is the question that I would ask. With my children, but particularly with my grandchild, children, there's the illusion that a baby is born cultureless, and that you just write you teach them the culture, but a baby is born with infinite range of sounds, And a lot of work done in Edinburgh says that the first relationship you make with a small baby, a newly born baby, is in sound. So the baby
Yes.
goes blah 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 blah, and you go blah blah blah, and the baby goes blah 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 blah, and then blah, blah. So you've got to learn to improvise with sound
Yes.
long before you can do that with words.
Yeah.
And that's the relationship, because the baby's creativity is validated through improvising with sound. And just recently, I've thought if that's true of a baby, it's probably also true of the dying. So my friend Ianthe was dying, and she'd lost all the words, and she was making sounds, and the assumption was that she was in pain. Well,
Mm.
she's in pain, we'll give her a bit more of this. But I didn't think she was.
Mm.
Ianthe had published some of my pieces to start with, and had been a marvelous feminist. And I was left alone with her for a bit. And so when she went, "Urgh," I went, "Urgh," and so on. So I entered into a conversation just like you would with a baby. She was
Mm.
still trying to make sounds to relate to you. And if you were prepared to join in, she would respond. And when her family came back, they said, "We think she knows you." And I didn't have the courage to say, because I entered into a improvisation with her. I think there's a lot to be done in the dying, that they're still trying to communicate, and we need to improvise with all these sounds that we've discarded, and
Yeah.
so on. So I'd like to look at that. I know that my friend Judith Silver runs the companion voices, singing around the beds of the dying. And I'd
Yeah.
done that before now, somebody who I'd sung a hymn that they knew or something. But the notion that you actually take their sounds and work with their sounds and
Yeah.
enter into a conversation with them, I think that's important.
Yes.
Because Jung wrote, I've just discovered it recently, that loneliness is not necessarily having people, but the inability to tell your story.
Mm.
And what is a dying person trying to do? Tell the remainder of their story.
Yes.
So they need that acknowledged in some way.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So I mean, that's fascinated me really.
That is fascinating, and it reminds me of when I worked in special needs schools and so-called. I always find some of these terms difficult to find the right word, really. But I just felt that children were communicating. They were just communicating, and they were communicating all the time, but just in different ways than we would consider verbal or so-called, socially acceptable, let's say. And the children, and we were always talking, and I remember being considered very strange by the staff because I would sit with the autistic children particularly and found that I could talk to them in sounds because I'd done so much sound improvising. So I would just think, well, I'm here with this child, let's just try and create a connection. If I do what they do, and surely that's affirming their world because all the time they're being told or trying to make them fit into a world where they don't fit. And so why not just try and meet this child where he or she or they are? And, that was very profound for me. And there was something called intensive interaction back then where we were, you would sit and just mirror everything that you had. And from some children who weren't able to move hardly anything, you were just looking for a flicker of an eyelid sometimes. And that was, that might be saying yes. And or that might be just the tiniest communication that you were just looking for and watching for. And that taught me an enormous amount about what you're saying, which is that, and that's what I believe. I know that in evolution, there's lots of debates about did singing come first, did words come first, did language. I mean, from me though, it makes sense that we evolve as babies through sound. And we go through babbling and improvisation into language secondarily. So we sing before we speak and we improvise before we speak. And so we all have that vocabulary in us, but we are, like you said, losing our note. We're kind of conditioned into things that say, why, oh no, now you're an adult, you forget all of that. You don't do that anymore. It's not acceptable. But we need it still, as you say, in these moments of dying and leaving and in other moments of our lives where things aren't verbal. Sometimes you just have to go, oh, there's nothing. If you're at the top of the mountain, you just have to go, oh, Wow, that's it. There isn't a sound, is there? Some type of words that expresses that enough.
Well, the problem with babies is not the baby. The problem is the parents who've already been enculturated into not doing those things. Um, and so we've got to, and also, I mean, going back to, as you say, I did a lot of work on children as composers. I was on a train once, and if I can remember a bit of the poem, um, the train also went ba da, and there was a 4-year-old behind me, and off he went da 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 da, about a 10-minute improvisation on the in relation to the sound. And the end of the poem says, "He has not yet learnt that he cannot compose, but we shall soon teach him."
Mm. Mm.
So we
I-
teach things out of people rather than encouraging them to go on with what they've already got. And I think
Yeah.
that's the tragedy of our education system. It assumes that our young people are blank slates on which we have to write our culture. Well, looking at the culture we've got at the moment, heaven preserve us from writing it on them. What they are is bubbling, creative human beings who want their creativity affirmed and then can use it to express themselves. I mean, one of the lovely moments I loved on Eurovision, it was in the first Ukrainian war, and Ukraine won. It was when Crimea went, and it was a wonderful woman. And of course, she'd won. And of course, we know when they interviews the winner, oh, it's marvelous. But she just sat in front of the people, and she'd sung a song about Ukraine. And people said, "What did it feel like to win?" And she simply said, "They heard my story."
Wow.
And I thought, what a clever woman this is. I mean, if
Mm.
you want the story of Ukraine heard, don't march in the centre of London, or, find a program with millions of viewers all over the world and sing your song. It
Yes.
was so simple. They
So
heard my story.
they heard my story. And that's what we're all longing for, isn't it? That's what everyone is longing for, their story to be heard and validated and affirmed, not for another story to be put on top, I guess, isn't it?
That's
And
right. Or for
that,
them to be so enculturated that they think they can't do it,
yeah,
because everyone can do it. I mean, and singing is power. And I
yeah,
think that's the horror of it. It's not a minor thing we've done in schools, taking away the singing voice. It's taking away their power. I mean, the quotation I always give is from the massacre at El Mozote, where a woman was going to be shot, and she kept on singing. As the squad got out, she sang and she sang, and they were puzzled. They couldn't stop her singing until they took a machete and chopped the throat. But that was power. And you only
mm,
got to look at the history of the slaves and the history of the Holocaust to see that in those situations people sang together as claiming their power. So
mm,
it's not a minor thing we've done. It's not, you know, that they don't know where, the capital of Cuba is. We've taken away the power. And I think as a child who was abused and who was lonely, but who could, do a very good tap dancing performance of Confidentially and could sing, that was, the only way I could make anything heard.
mm,
Not overtly, not in the crudity of what was happening, but it was at least of being listened to.
yes. And finding your voice through a form that
That's
could give you
right.
expression, and it is that we are given cultural forms, aren't we? And
Yeah.
to pour ourselves into, and we have to use what we have at the time. So you had confidentiality, and that's what gave you. And that's so interesting, isn't it? Especially given the name of that song.
Well, it was, in many ways, if you look back at it, it was a really bizarre, it was my party piece. Confidentially, I like to talk confidentially. With folks like you, confidentially, I'll tell you this. I wouldn't if it wasn't true, but now I think you ought to know. So keep it dark, because you see that it's very confidentially. And then it ends with "Don't tell a soul I love you." I
Wow.
mean, it was an incredible song, and although nobody interpreted it as what was going on, I can see now why it was Reginald Dixon's song he used to play the organ that comes up out of the floor, the cinema organ. And that was his that I but I mean, in a sense, the song that was my signature tune was, in fact, a true expression of what was actually happening to me.
Yeah.
And "Don't tell a soul I love you" was precisely what the man said. you know. So there you are. It played a very significant part, or it was never interpreted as such, in my life as a child.
Wow. And isn't that something like I believe like that songs are medicine, I mean, it's very moving to hear you talk about that. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that and how hard that must have been for your child to have to stand up and perform this song and be telling your story, but not able to tell the truth and say help, and get help. It must have been a very, 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 very traumatic thing for you. And yet, songs are medicine, aren't they? And I don't think it's an accident, which songs we gravitate towards and which songs, I personally see it as all very, um, it's like we all have our own mythological tapestry that we live in. And songs and imagery is all part of that. And that somehow we pull in or we get attracted to or we encounter the songs that we need as medicine in that particular moment. And that song was your medicine at that moment.
Well, it's odd because in very ways it was an unbelievably wise choice, if you can call it that. Because
Yeah,
if I'd said what was going on, I'd have been told that I was a seductive little girl, and this was a lovely man, and what a lovely man he was, and indeed he was. Most people thought he was a lovely man. Um, that there was no other way of telling it, because I couldn't have told it in words, because I'd simply have been blamed. In
yeah,
those, remember, this is the 1940s,
yeah,
where the blame would all be on the woman.
of course.
So,
Yeah.
in many ways, it was an unbelievably wise choice.
Yeah. And did you ever have a moment where you later did speak out? Did that happen for you? Or obviously it was
Well,
happening to you.
no, for a variety of reasons, it was never told. I did, in fact, very interestingly, talking about singing. Um, if it had been revealed, my family would have broken up, and I couldn't. But I mean, but I did feel that something had to be said. So when he died, I did go and see his body and spent three-quarters of an hour with him, and actually sang him a song and said that it was all over now. Um, and so on. And I did that through a song, which interestingly, hadn't really thought about it until talking with you. It's one of the hymns I wrote, which is "We sing a love that sets all people free, that blows in wind, that burns in scorching flame, enfolds in earth, springs up like in water clear. Come, um, freeing love, live in our hearts today." And so on. And it was a whole song. It's one of the hymns I'm known for, um, and has become extremely popular in the church's dilemmas around sexuality and so on. But it looks at various forms of love, and so on, and says, so. And that was the song I sang him. And so I closed it really, and not by confronting him or anybody or the justice system with what had been done, but simply by singing him this song and setting him free to die,
Wow. June,
which was
that's
not easy.
no, I can imagine that must have been incredibly, incredibly difficult. And it's incredibly brave that you were able to use song to heal yourself and to let him go. And to come to some kind of closure for yourself.
Yeah.
Wow.
I've been told many times that it should have been dealt with in the way that our society deals with it, with courts but I never felt that was right. And
It's right.
unfortunately, again, you have a situation where you're told what is the right thing to do when you know it's not the right thing to do, but people keep pressing you. So although as a child of 7, I would have been told it was my fault. As a woman in her 70s, I was also told it was my fault because I wouldn't do the right thing.
Wow. I know, and it's so, and yeah. And what you were reaching for, which I know is practiced in different cultures, is more of a reconciliation process of justice, restorative justice rather than punitive justice, because
Absolutely. Yeah,
ultimately what you needed was something different than being dragged through a court and having all of those things and
absolutely.
what that would have entailed and done for you. And that's what's also, yeah, there's a lot of talk about, well, people don't tell and they don't come forward. Well, no wonder, because the system is so traumatic for everyone. The justice system is so flawed. And then what's the end outcome? Yeah, I had a court case myself with someone, a voyeur actually, and and I was asked what would I have wanted, and I was thinking, what do I want out of this process that I've been presented with? And I thought, well, if anything, I just want that person to have an opportunity to heal and to look at what that was about for them, if that's appropriate for them. So therapy, basically, or some kind, the idea of someone going to prison because of something, I just thought, well, that's not going to do anything for them. It's not going to do anything for them.
And I wouldn't have been allowed to sing in court,
No,
but I
quite.
could alone with a dead man.
Yeah.
So, and I think there are a huge variety of ways. And as one who's had to deal with, as a priest, with sort of historic child abuse, people must be allowed to deal with it in the way that they think is right. And that's where I come back to my Christian faith. Jesus always said, the kingdom of, or and I prefer the kingdom, God is within, that you must always listen to the inner voice of the person. And if that doesn't fit with the cultural assumptions, then it must be that inner voice that's heard, not the voice of the culture. And I
Mm,
think we make huge mistakes. And I think we have made mistakes in the area of abuse because we now have a sort of model of abuse, which is a poor person living in a council flat abused by a group of foreign men. But there are other situations of abuse which are much, much more complicated than that, where the stereotypes don't fit
no.
and
And
also don't work.
that's right. And also we don't look enough at what I believe is what creates perpetrators. What's the perpetrator story and how did they
That's
get
right.
there, and what is it we need to look at in our society that engenders that kind of abuse and makes it possible, because it doesn't come from a vacuum, and
Well,
it
if you look
always.
at my story, you can see that very clearly because as a child who didn't experience a great deal of love, I was wide open to
Mm,
someone who did apparently love me.
yeah,
you know.
yeah,
So,
right,
and that's what's not looked at.
yeah,
Why did the young children who were abused by teams of men, why didn't they have the love anywhere else that was given? I mean that people aren't prepared to ask the most profound questions.
yeah,
They'll ask the surface ones, where the profound questions are not. And I did write a song, a very long song actually, about forgiveness, because that actually worked extremely well. All the stages you go through of the anger and the vengeance, and then the understanding of the culture and so on. And
yeah,
that was I often use that as a basis of a piece called Forgiveness, because really forgiveness is not for the other person. It's actually for you. Only
yeah,
when you've forgiven can you let it go in some way or use it in some way. And I do find that things that are difficult, I usually turn into a song. That's the way that I have of dealing with them. So rather than just feeling the feelings, we'll turn it into another one woman show. Um, at the
Yeah,
moment, one I'm working on is called Daring to Hope. But I
beautiful.
was very influenced. I was in music and peacemaking with Olivier Aubin, who's from Japan, and is running a big music and peacemaking. But we had several conferences, one in Madrid, and at that conference, Rick Pagliari, who was a friend of Pete Seeger, was there, and he told very movingly then the story of how he was American, how he was asked to go back to a family reunion, and his father, I think, had abused him physically, not sexually, um, probably in terms of corporal punishment. I mean, he didn't know how to go back, but he knew he had to go back because he had to go back into the family. And he decided the only way to come back was to write a song.
Right.
And he wrote a song about his father, but it also showed how his father was shaped by what it meant to be a man.
Yeah,
And he talked about the black leather strap. You know, you were taught to use that. You weren't taught to tie the shoes. You
yeah,
were taught, and that enabled him to come back. This powerful song that he wrote about his father.
wow,
And he sang it and went back and was able to go back because he'd created a song he could sing to his father. And interestingly, after that, I wrote, well, a song for my mother, um, Flesh of one flesh once joined together, mother and daughter, what do you feel? Um, this is your song to show how I feel. So what shall we say of our living together? So I wrote a song for her and eventually wrote another song for my father, which in a strange way, long after they died. But, I believe that they're still around. They're still
yeah,
around in me anyway, because I've got
yeah,
their genes, that one can resolve these issues with
yeah,
songs for the dead. And in a sense, our culture doesn't deal with the ancestors, but in other cultures, the ancestors had numerous songs that were
yeah,
written for them and written about them. And
yeah,
that's the healing bit, because
yeah,
it means that the living person is somehow or other processing. And in many ways, it's an easier way of processing than, as you rightly say, the judicial system. Um, and I mean, around about some of the dreadful things that happened in Manchester, um, one of the people, she had resolved the situation. And that was actually not by singing, but by playing the violin. Um, and then committed suicide when it came to the courts.
wow.
So, in a sense, by music and song in particular, has a way of bringing about forgiveness and understanding that maybe the courts haven't got.
Wow. June, that is so powerful. And that phrase keeps coming to me like physician, heal thyself, because it feels like as musicians, we're constantly healing ourselves through singing and music, as well as offering that in spaces where it might be, supporting others. And yeah, the fact that singing and music can meet us in places that many of our social structures cannot meet us and cannot hold us. But music can. Music can hold us through the most incredible things. And what you've described, and thank you for sharing your story so personally and profoundly. I know I've known you a long time, but there's things you've shared with me that I didn't know today. So thank you because I feel incredibly moved, and I'm sure there are people who are listening will relate to that. And I feel the message of hope that, yeah, the daring to hope, the hope that we can, because I believe everything we've talked about is natural and innate. It's just that we've thought ourselves away from it and structured ourselves, but actually it is there and it's indwelling, and it only takes a breath to get back to it, as that singer discovered at Space for Peace. It only takes a breath to come back to your voice and remember, this is my voice, this is my body, this is my breath. And that is there every minute of our living life, even when language has disappeared, even when hearing is disappearing, even, So it's still there. So that's the message of hope. And that I feel I've taken personally from this, and I hope that other people, I'm sure they will have heard many other very hopeful, inspiring messages. So thank you, June. Thank you for sharing at that level and that depth with us. I'm really profoundly touched. And it's really hard to wrap up because I know that we could talk for a long, long time. and especially after such a deep, profound journey. But is there anything you'd like to say in
Well, I
closing?
just like to thank, like the Ukrainian singer did, thank you. I've told you some of my story, and thank you for listening and listening with compassion and understanding. And that is what one hopes for. And thank you for, I've watched you for a long time. I've sung with you, been alongside you, and so on, particularly in the heart lung choir and the church, where people are being prescribed singing, the notion of music, of less music on prescription, all of that, I mean, is important. And I mean, you have more years on this planet than I probably have. And, thank you for, hearing the messages of the past of an elder, and carry on working in the future so that people can reclaim their power and that the culture doesn't take it away.
Oh,
Thank you.
June, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for being an absolute inspiration. Your legacy is extraordinary, and I know we've only just touched on the so many, the multiplicity of projects and places and internationally that you have touched with your voice, with your storytelling, and with your commitment to supporting others to be heard and to explore their voices and to improvise and to come together and share difference. And I know you've done that in some extraordinary situations and been willing to continuously put yourself in situations where anything can happen. And I've experienced your nurturing and I've seen the way that you nurture groups and communities, and it's so incredible. And I feel, yeah, you've just always been an incredible inspiration to me. So thank you very much for coming to
I
share.
should have said that Space for Peace is carrying on. We've got our new project called Creative Voices for Peace, based
Oh,
in Winchester. And
great.
so people lamented the passing of it, and the Quakers took it up. And now we've got, I think, 200 people on the book, including lovely Zoe running the community choir in Petersfield,
Wow.
including this time the Druids who went in and they're chanting. So if people want, I expect they can get from you, Katie, how to contact me, the Music, Spirituality and Wellbeing website, but Creative Voices for Peace, um, which we're doing not in the cathedral, but in the park in the centre of Winchester in September.
Wow, fantastic. That's amazing. And I'll make sure, yeah, we'll put June's, you've got a wonderful website, haven't you? Which we'll make sure that we share in the information with the podcast, and we'll make sure that people can find out about that and come and take part and come and find your new show when it comes out, Daring to Hope, and also access some of your beautiful, stunning music and all of your books. There's so much to discover about June's work, so please do go and find out about all of that and absorb, some of the incredible wisdom that you've shared today and through all of your incredible creations in the world.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, June. Thank you.
Change the world with your voice.